So the way this is going to work is unknown to the organisers, except for the first bit. I'm going to introduce Helena, and then I'm going to sit down, and they're going to figure it out between them what they want to do for the next hour. So my introduction to Helena is she's one of the good people. So, and I mean that quite seriously, that she is somebody who's stood up for the underdog and has campaigned throughout her life for those people who are being disadvantaged in society. And she's well known for her role as a QC in human rights. I've almost forgiven her for going to the House of Lords, but it's a bit touch and go for those of us from a particular persuasion and background. However, I think the best way I can introduce her is she's Cleo's mother. And Cleo played with my daughter Rosalind, so that's how come I know her and was able to invite her and come to do this meeting this afternoon. Helena.
Peter, it's always lovely to see you. I didn't realise how colour coordinated I am. I want you all to take a look and just see how colour coordinated this whole thing is. It's not normally the way. I just want to say, first of all, it's a great honour to be here. And it's a while since I have been in this wonderful room and in this great building. And it's a while since I chaired the Human Genetics Commission, which I actually did for nearly 10 years. And it was created in 1998, as some of you with long memories might know. And it was created at the time when the decoding of the genome first took place, and where there was concern in government that there should be some body, some organism that would deal with the legal, moral, and ethical issues that might arise. And I just, so that any of you who don't know, and there's young folk in this audience who were too young to even, you were in school at the time, was that I actually did think it was one of those quangos that really did have a very valuable role. And one of the things, for example, that we were able to do was we got the police to have ethical committees so that the retention of DNA had to have proper oversight, and that there was a body who would decide the circumstances in which it could be, uses could be made of DNA. We stimulated the debate about whether retention forever was an appropriate thing in relation to DNA for criminal justice purposes. We also we actually made it a criminal offence to steal DNA. And we weren't thinking about medical professionals. We were thinking about the paparazzi. We were thinking about family members, the mother-in-law who says, that child's not my son's child, and would take hair out of the head of a child and then, go through private processes to expose the fact that the child had not been fathered by someone in the family. And those sorts of privacy issues are really important, and particularly where it's about the well-being of a child, we felt that the applications for that kind of testing should be done with the authority of the courts, and that it shouldn't be possible for newspapers and the tabloids to be able to do it, or private detective agencies and the like. So there were a whole set of things that the Commission was dealing with. And at that time, and it was in the bonfire of the quangos after 2010, it stopped existing. I was no longer the chair. I think it was Sir John Sulston was in the chair at that time. But all I can tell you is that in its lifetime, it was involved in a very important period, I think, and did very good work. But of course, so much has happened since that I don't feel really greatly in touch anymore. I mean, the idea that now the debate has moved on from the debates which were very potent at the time, which were about when does life begin. You got embroiled in the whole of the abortion debate and the pro-life debate. With people who felt that the use of embryonic stem cells was really not right. And so there was a very different kind of debate from the one I think that's happening now. It was still very much on the horizon that we would be talking about some of the issues that you've been talking about today. Now, I want to introduce you to my really remarkable panel. On my left is Robin Lovell-Badge, and Dr. Lovell-Badge is interested in decisions of cell fate, especially within the context of sex discrimination in mammals. And he discovered that a single gene, STRI, present on the Y chromosome, sets cells of the reproductive organs on the path to becoming male. Should you want your reproductive organs to move from being one thing to another. And you were responsible for Randy. How did you get the name Randy for the mouse, the female mouse, whom you engineered into becoming a male mouse?
Well, basically because he was Randy.
He was Randy?
You put him in
Everybody noticed how Randy was. Yeah. But you made him Randy.
No, he was, he was behaved like other male mice, basically. So most male mice are quite Randy.
So the test was, in getting a female mouse to become a male mouse, they became classically male.
Yeah.
So we're going to avoid this. The women in the audience know that we're going to avoid this when it comes to humans. Anyway, but his work has included a focus on stem cells. I think that, one of the great breakthroughs has happened there in that stem cells, of course, have this pluripotential ability to turn into any cell that it chooses to turn into in the body, and by studying genes, you've sort of been looking at what is it that gives that creates that ability.
Yeah.
And so we've got somebody here that we can really nail down on that business of what it is about these cells that gives them that incredible potential for becoming any kind of cell that you might want to replace in the human body. Some of Robin's research is conducted using mouse models, but he also has been using chicks, and I think that's been for an evolutionary perspective that you've done that. He's very interested in the public perception of using animals in research and has been involved in the debates around that. And I'm sure that there'll be opportunities for us to have that discussion with him today. Sarah, over to you. Sarah is a Chancellors Fellow of the Usher Institute of Population Health Sciences and Informatics. She's also the Deputy Director of the Mason Institute for Medicine, Life Sciences and Law at Edinburgh University. Before that, she was involved at Manchester University and was a fellow in bioethics. Sarah's previous research in interdisciplinary bioethics focused on new technologies, new biomedical technologies, and she has been very much involved in stem cell research and embryo research. And so if we want to talk about reproductive medicine, synthetic biology, the whole business of genetic modification, those things, we've got the right woman in our midst. And it's great that you're here with us for this. And finally, we really have somebody who's had a really great life career in big pharma. Dr. Mark Robertson is involved with Science Policy Compass, which is a company. He's the founder and director of it, and it's a consultancy which offers science policy support and advice on a whole kind of range of bioethical topics. His current real interest is in biosector reputation, access to samples, human biological samples for research use, he's been looking at the whole business of gene editing, gene therapy ethics, the Nagoya Protocol, and he's really been engaging very deeply with the ethics around all of these issues. He was involved with AstraZeneca, he was there a director, and he was very much involved with bioethics there, chairing their bioethics advisory group. And so 30 years in the whole pharmaceutical industry, and a great person to talk to us about all of that. Now, I want to start by asking you three, about the challenges. I mean, anybody in the field, one of the things that became very clear to me when I was chairing the Human Genetics Commission was just how conscious and alert to ethics scientists are. You know, this business that's run in the Daily Mail, that somehow scientists are not very interested in ethics, is just so untrue. And every scientist I met engaged and really grappled with the ethical issues. And so I wanted to ask you, first of all, Robin, what are the big ones that are facing you just now? I mean, what is your mailbag full of? What are people picketing the fences, picketing outside with? You know, what are they worried about?
Okay. I mean, okay, with respect to the genome editing topic of the meeting, you know, there are, I guess the emails I get are from individuals who have affected children who have genetic disease, or you know, relations, or they fear that they're going to have a child with a genetic disease. And they can, you know, they've heard about the potential of using genome editing to either treat existing patients or perhaps to prevent children being born with genetic disease. And they want to know, well, you know, when this is going to happen, is it going to happen, how can it happen? And of course, the issues are at the moment that, I mean, somatic genome editing is permitted and it's happening, as we've heard today. But germline or making heritable changes is not currently permitted in the UK. So the issues that I worry about, one of the issues I worry about, of course, is whether the regulations are fit for purpose, whether they are sufficiently adaptable to the very rapid changes that we're seeing in the science and the possibilities that brings. There are, we did this public engagement exercise for the Royal Society, which was published today, which suggests that actually the majority of the people asked the question either in small focus groups or in a big survey, actually don't really distinguish between somatic genome editing and making heritable changes. So for them it's just, well, can you use these techniques to prevent nasty things happening? So it's getting this, an adaptable regulatory system, I think, is one of the major challenges.
But even in that context, you get quite divided positions amongst people with disabilities.
There's a whole issue, the disability rights viewpoint, and maybe Sarah wants to address that later, but I mean, my own view is that just because we might be able to stop some children being born with diseases doesn't have to have any effect whatsoever on our value of the way we treat people who have disabilities. We're always going to have people with disabilities. We can't stop spontaneous mutations. We can't stop genetic disease, etc. And as we've had other techniques have been developed, like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, to be able to select against embryos that are going to get a disease and select for those that won't. Actually, we see that our appreciation and care for and provision for people with disabilities has gone up. So there's no correlation between the eliminating and lack of appreciation. So.
Sarah, I mean, you're involved in this similar set of discussions around, and presumably your postbag is similar. In that the people are writing about the same things. What could you do so that I can be sure that my children don't inherit something that we know is in our family? But there are others who would take great exception to even the possibility of that. What other things are coming through?
I'd like to pick 3 issues, I think, to highlight. We've had an absolutely great roundup today of some of the science issues, and I'd like to pick on issues from ethics, engagement and policy, which I think are equally important. The first one, relating to engagement, picks up on what Robin said. People are keen for genome editing technologies. There are people out there who want these things. I think one of the big issues that faces us is asking, how are they going to get access to these? What are they going to get access to? And I think there is a real danger at the moment that if we are not engaging sufficiently and in the right ways to meet the needs of these people, that they will start looking elsewhere, that commercial providers selling things that go under the banner of genome editing will cash in on the excitement and start to market treatments. I've seen some very worrying co-opting of the rhetoric around democratization of science to actually mean commercialization. So democratization, if you can buy for hundreds of pounds a CRISPR kit and inject yourself, I think that is commercialization and not democratization. If you are a neoliberal economist, you might say the same thing, but I think most right-thinking people would differ. So that's one issue. How do we engage in a way that means that everybody can go forward together in a safe way to achieve genetic therapies that work at a sensible pace? So that's one issue. The second issue relates more to ethical questions. So I always say that genetic modification is something we have been discussing for a long time. We've been talking about the ethics of this. And what's really changed with gene editing is, because of the pace of the technology, the ease, the scale at which we can deploy it, it has meant that certain things now become practical. It has changed the risk profile. So we used to be able to agree to disagree, if you like, that whether or not in principle we thought that human genetic modification was acceptable, we could say, well, but it's too risky. And now we're very soon going to get to the point, if we're not there already, that forms of human genetic modification previously unthinkable are now perhaps not too physically risky. The sorts of concerns, we've seen some great talks on how those concerns are being addressed, how the uncertainties are being mapped out. We're going to get to the point eventually where we have to say, well, what's the moral risk that we're trying to co-negotiate here with physical risk, and how can we address that ethically? That applies, of course, not only to healthcare uses, but also to the environmental and agricultural uses around which there is concern. So how do we balance and manage moral risk, physical risk, our responsibility for our choices to act? And of course, to do that and to understand what acceptable risks are and how we think responsibility for these technologies should be put in place, we will need engagement, and we will need to think about how that plays out in a policy setting. And the third issue, this one, again, the focus is policy, but it will require input from the other two, is to think about how we regulate these not just in the UK, but at an international level. So the other thing that we hear very often is, well, I think we have a pretty good system of regulation here, but we don't know what's happening over there. And by over there, they mean in other countries, often in countries with different cultures or different levels of development. And of course, the worry here is that we may get people going to different places where there isn't regulation to seek out treatments or to have a go of technologies. And of course, if a country over the border creates a genetically modified animal or plant that escapes, plants and animals don't recognise these borders. It's going to come to us whether we like it or not. So I think the final thing is that we absolutely need a coordinated international policy approach. And how do we achieve that?
Mark, over to you. What are the challenges in your area?
Well, I think probably some overlap, but I'm mostly concerned that the general population doesn't really understand what we've got here. You know, I'm not a molecular biologist. I've never used CRISPR. It's not my baby, but I think unlike all of the speakers today, it's their baby. And so anyone that's in the audience that doesn't understand CRISPR, they might be thinking, well, they would say that it's important because that's what they do. I don't do it. I've been drawn to this area with incredible fascination. As pointed out, I look at a whole range of bioethical issues relevant to the biosector. This one is by far the most fascinating and huge impacting on society of all of them that I've ever come across. And I'm really old now, and it's still, for me, is amazing where this is going to go. And I'm worried that the general population don't get it enough. So I think we should do more public engagement, mega. And in fact, Jennifer mentioned this morning that they were talking to movie makers about some ideas, and that's the only way you're going to get it across. I thought that was superb. You know, I've been trying to think back to other scientific or technological milestones, and the one that I think is as big as this is going back into the 19th century, 1846, when William Morris demonstrated the ether dome. And it was the first time ever that a proper anaesthetic was applied to a patient publicly, and the chap had a tumour removed from his neck successfully. That set the scene for modern surgery over the last 150 years. And this is as significant as that. It's going to change everything. It's going to change what it means to be human. And I don't think people get it, and I think we've all got to get our heads around it, including us as well, even more, but definitely the general public.
That poses a challenge. How do you make that accessible? How do you turn it into a story that isn't a fear story, but a positive story for the son?
Well, the best way is if you already have good examples where it's positive. No, I mean, for somatic genome editing, that's I think going to happen. For germline, we can't until we know we can do it.
But
that's a catch-22.
Even on the somatic, what are the good stories? What is this? A simple good story that could be run in a big public newspaper. You know, one of the tabloids.
Well, the people in the audience who probably explain more. We've had some examples here. So if so the things that have been tried already, things like treating patients with HIV. There's the trials. Breast ones? No, none of the breast ones. No, which HIV? So, no. What else? There's trials which are going to be starting on things like sickle cell disease and thalassemia. CAR T. The CAR T cells obviously is a very clear example of a cell-based therapy that's been where the techniques have been used. That was a very well known. That's been publicised already quite widely. So there's a lot of good examples already. There are going to be many more coming over the next few years. And people whose story can be told about how it's changed their prospects completely. I'm just interested though, Mark, because you're there in the world that we just had described to us. Sarah was mentioning that there are going to be ways in which this could be privatized. This could end up being something that people could access in rather different ways from the ways in which would involve a regulatory framework. How do you deal with that? Or is that an opportunity rather than an inhibition as you see it?
Well, it's a risk. Jennifer's slide this morning of the exponential increase in number of papers and uses of CRISPR is all new technologies that are important have that sort of uplift at the beginning, and they plateau 2 years and nobody talks about it anymore. But I've got a feeling that this one's going to just keep going for a long time. And so regulation and policy are slow. Even within a big pharma, where you've got pretty good control and you can jolly things along in that community, it's difficult to introduce a new policy. The technology, the risk is that the scientists and the technologists are going to do stuff, and they'll probably be doing stuff that we haven't even thought about yet that is a problem. So that's going to carry on happening, and it's going to happen so fast. We've got to try and keep up as policymakers and regulators. I don't think that will happen. And therefore, I think that we will see mistakes or tragedies even related to the use of CRISPR eventually, because of all of this activity that's new and people are going crazy with it. A couple of those can really hamper progress in a good way. So for me, the challenge is to get that discussion going with the general public, so that when that tragedy or, something goes wrong, they're actually understanding of that, put it in context, and actually don't mind and allow the progression of this incredible technology.
But that is never how things happen.
No, but I'm thinking we've got an opportunity. There's a window of opportunity between where we are now and the first big mistake. And we've got to push into that hole and try and do it. We've had so many examples of other incredible technologies where that hasn't happened and the public have reacted, and it sets everything back by several years. We have to learn from the previous mistakes and try somehow to get it out there so that they're with us and accept the odd mistake which is going to happen.
I want to just tease out the business about mistakes that you say are bound to happen. Would the right kind of regulatory framework prevent mistakes happening?
They would definitely help prevent that, but as I said, regulation is always behind what's actually happening.
But we're identifying just now the fact that we're on a moment of great breakthrough, and that the speed of this is great. If you were to regulate just now, Robin, what would you want to do?
Well, we heard a very nice talk this morning from Joyce Tate about how you would regulate things, and so I think regulating the end product, the product, what you're trying to do,
yes,
is going to be a much more better
way of doing it,
than
looking
regulating
at the outcomes
the
and
process rather than
yeah,
the process. I think, you're absolutely right that bad examples are not going to help the field, but again, this is part of the public engagement thing. So in this public engagement report we published today, without any prompting, members of the public came up with this, that the regulation mustn't be so tight and tough that it delays things or it stops the science or the applications from developing. And they understood, things are a risk, so you always have to look at the risk versus benefit, and the regulations should accommodate that.
But I think that they're happy to say that because you've had that engagement and they feel part of the team.
Yeah.
It's the vast masses of people that aren't part of the team that I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
You obviously are working on the whole business of ethics in this field, and you've obviously thought about it. What sort of regulatory framework would you be envisaging, Sarah?
Well, you can't regulate to prevent all risks. No matter what framework we have, I could be coming out of the gene therapy clinic and be run over by a bus. You're not going to be able to. We can't absolutely guarantee, even with the best regulation. I think the only regulation that would stop anything bad happening as a result of using CRISPR would be to say, let's not use it ever, and then think of all the bad things that would happen because we didn't use it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's quite key to think about what we want is actually not a framework that absolutely reduces the risk of anything happening, because the best way for nothing to happen is to do nothing. What we actually want is this, what is the balance of risk and benefits? Who decides that? I think what Mark just said about being part of a team who gets to have a say in what risks and benefits are seen as appropriate is very important. So, for example, when you're talking about a particular disease, I think the example I always use when people say how are cell and gene therapies, what are some examples of how they've benefited us so far? I always use the great example of the CAR T engineered cell therapy that we just heard about. But the really good things about that include the risk profile, the fact that there was no other option, the extensive safety testing and control of the procedure that was done. I think all of those things are what we should be looking for. So we can't say regulate for no risk, we can say regulate for the optimal risk-benefit balance, make sure that the way that we define that balance is something that is done, that is decided with input from appropriate stakeholders, and that there's transparency around it. So I think, what would be a really bad news story when the first CRISPR-related adverse clinical event occurs, will be it coming out of nowhere from a trial that nobody knew about, with no information on what the safety profile was, what tests were done, what steps were taken to try and ethically manage the risk. And on the other hand, if it's done with transparency, people know you can't, no matter whether we research into it or not, you can determine cell fate, but you can't determine our fate entirely.
I'm just interested I mean, most regulation is done around that balancing act between risk and benefit. And we know that in research there are going to be experiments and things that fail. I'm just wondering about why it is that in this area you get so much more of a kind of public angst.
I mean,
is it about the nature of humanity? I mean, that's what I'm really wanting us to...
Perhaps, and of course there are sectors of society who are very, very hesitant, shall I say, in the application of these technologies, and so they worry about changing humanity. They worry about, messing around with the early human embryo. If you're doing heritable genome editing, you might have to. They're worried about issues of what's normal, what's enhancement. So are you going
the pursuit of perfection and what that means?
You're going to step over this boundary, which is impossible to define really. What's a normal, usual,
an acceptable improvement and what is considered to be enhancement.
So they're very against this, and so they're very vocal in this, and then that's why you see lots of headlines about designer babies and this and that. And of course, those headlines are going to affect people's views until they actually get to sit down and look in detail about what the issues are and how the things work, and then they're fine with it. It's just this: if you have maybe a very small minority of people can distort a debate quite significantly.
Our experience was when the Human Genetics Commission was operating, and it was having debates about these things, was that when you brought people into the room and it was very carefully orchestrated, often people were surprised that it wasn't as they imagined. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the things, was that people often shifted their position when they actually heard people who suffered from Tay-Sachs or suffered from one of the diseases that could have benefit from advances in the science. And when they heard about what people suffered and what it meant in families, it was an important way of addressing some of those kind of first gut responses.
The patient voice is really, really important.
Crucial in this.
Absolutely.
One of the ways that we did that was by having a consultative panel where it was, which was huge, and where people could join and could interact with it and express views and do it using modern technology. And it was interesting because people could really say, I have a child who suffers from this, and we had it in the family, and they're able to take people on a journey through what it has meant, what change could mean for them. What about you? How do you get the public on side? I mean, we talk about public engagement, but I mean that the public are being engaged through often the most coarse and unsatisfactory means, where there's little nuance, there's little subtlety in the discussions, and there's little of the...
I think one of the challenges for us is how we engage with the very diverse range of publics out there in very large numbers. So I'm doing, I don't know, a dozen odd events like this over the next month, at each of which there will be about the same number of people who are here, and even so, that's a tiny drop in the whole number of people just in the UK, let alone anywhere else. One of the areas that I'm working in at the moment actually is trying to understand how we can use digital technologies and social media better to engage with wider groups. So you talked about a consultative panel where people can come along and tell their story. Nowadays, publics are using internet forums. So there are forums out there for patient groups, for people with particular interests in technologies, where they go on and they tell their stories, share their hopes and concerns, etc. And I actually think that there has been maybe not enough done from the academic community to engage in these ways, because what you see developing there, social media, it's a two-edged sword. You get people able to share information, able to connect. You also get mobilization of groups like the anti-vaccination lobby. So the question for us is, how do we meaningfully engage in that way so that we're getting the right information exchange and people are not going off and making up myths and propagating fake news about genetic technologies? That's a challenge for us.
If you were going to regulate, I mean, Robin just mentioned that earlier today it was suggested that you, in fact, you regulate for the outcome rather than processes. At least that was one of the suggestions that was made by someone this morning. Would that work?
Regulate for the outcome?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the specific, the disease you're treating, rather than regulate the use of CRISPR, for example.
Yeah, I think the patient population is essential to get them tied in. I think the danger with this sort of discussion is that you're including everything that's going to happen tomorrow and everything that could happen in 50 years as well. And so we need to sort of take each step at a time. The first sort of things that are happening are with discrete patients, somatic treatments. They approve, obviously, of their treatment because they are in dire straits. Even with germline editing, you can make a case that there will be certain patient populations who are incredibly accepting of that concept. And I've got personal information from one type of rare disease, and when you hear the story, it's 100% that you should do that, something like that for them. And so that's where you would start. You engage with the patient group that absolutely dregs it from you, and that would get more public acceptance. But I think so that's sort of regulating the outcome in a sense. But I think the place to hit is education in schools, and that already bioethics is very prominent in schools. I was amazed how when my kids grew up, they knew about bioethics really well, and it wasn't something in my day that was ever mentioned. But there could be a great opportunity to have a sort of government-approved content about this, which is someone like Robin casts his eye over, that would be put out there across, and because we're talking about the next 50 years here. This is going to impact and change over the next 50 years. And so we've got to target the kids and get them to understand it.
Now, my friend who invited me to come along this afternoon to be here and to hear what was going on, as well as to have the fun of cheering you, Peter was saying that, as has already been mentioned, is that it's going to become possible to actually buy this stuff online, that you might be able to self-inject and self-treat and do all manner of things to yourself, and that this could be the beginning of living well into, living forever, possibly.
Well, there's a bit of a disconnect there, because I think the people
Peter, he was clearly just being challenging, but it's certainly one of the things that would concern people, I think, is the idea that that this is going to become so commercially available that there will be pharmaceutical companies which don't have bioethics committees like the ones that you have directed, Mark, where it will be for sale, that people will be able to, it won't be, Mrs. Smith down the road, but Peter Goodfellow and others will be able to self-medicate. What about, or self-enhance or whatever, what about that?
Well, that's the sort of thing that we have to regulate against completely. And there have always been people that have done maverick things with new technologies and tried to make a point. Sometimes, I'm thinking of Roger Altunian.
Not trying to make a point, trying to make a buck.
Well, yes, but both. There have been historical people in the history of healthcare development who have actually done things to themselves that they would have probably been put in prison for now, but made a big advance in the step of the science at the time. We've got to completely regulate against that. We've got to educate people that isn't a sensible thing. We have to do safe medicine, otherwise that's bound to go wrong, and that will just hold things up.
Sarah?
I'd like to make two points in relation to that. So we are seeing, I take at the moment the way that the cell-based therapy industry is going as a sort of model for what could happen with genome editing in the next few years if we're not careful. so the first point is we need to be careful about how we use the word commercial. I think we know what we mean when we say those who are out to make a buck and aren't concerned about safe medicine, but I think we need to be very careful how we talk about it, because of course there is a lot of commercial and industry involvement in some very, very good science. So let's be careful how we...
highly ethical, of course.
Yeah, how we use that word, but that taken. The other thing is that in the cell therapy industry at the moment in relation to regenerative medicine and the sorts of promises which were made, so these promissory futures about living forever, living healthily, etc., were all associated with stem cells back in the day, still are. And what we're seeing is a lot of scientists are saying, oh, but patients just need to be better informed. If they knew the risks, they wouldn't do it. We need to regulate more. If we regulate enough, we can regulate this problem away. And patients are saying, actually, we're not ill-informed. A patient with a condition often will know just as much about it, if not more than their doctor. Mm-hmm. So they are informed. And as for the regulating it away, patients are fighting the regulation. The FDA at the moment has this massive fight on its hands because patients are saying, you want to regulate away the therapies that I want to try to potentially save my life. So, I think, yes, education's important. Yes, regulation has a role, but those two things alone, if we don't talk to people in the right way, if we don't listen to what they say and bring them on board with the decision making, are not going to be enough.
You see, I think you've put your finger on the real dilemma, which is that, and it goes back to the business of modern technology providing us with access to knowledge that we would have had great difficulty accessing in the past. And so patients are better informed than ever before, and can access information at short order when they suddenly get a diagnosis, and are often better informed certainly than their general practitioner. Maybe not their specialist, but their general practitioner. And that sense of entitlement is one that it would be very hard to turn around and say to people that they aren't entitled to it. And many people, when it comes to, what we know now is that many people, when they're coming to decisions, life and death decisions, would rather say, I'm prepared to try something that hasn't gone through all the regulatory processes. I want that, state of the art, that new chemotherapy or whatever it is. I want that because I'd rather take the chance because it might actually buy me the extra time and so I think there's a very interesting, very fine line between how you and what you regulate for, and while respecting autonomy and the right of the individual to be able to make serious decisions about their lives.
But one of the critical things, though, is that if a patient is going to, have experiments done on themselves by a clinic like Sarah's referring to, which is not doing things according to the normal rules, that if they do that, then there's no information of what happened to the patient. So there's no benefit to the community or anyone else. So what we have to encourage people is that you only have a treatment, an experimental treatment, if the results of that treatment get to be known to everyone else.
Yeah, obviously that's one aspect, but the other aspect is that there's no guarantee that although the theoretical principle of what they're receiving is good and useful to them, that the product that they actually inject is any use whatsoever. And that's my concern. I think largely it won't
that's
be.
where we need regulation.
Yeah.
I'm going to open this out to the floor. For those of you who might have thoughts, ideas, anecdotes or whatever, to tell us about that challenge, that as this science is developing and developing at speed, which will often bring real value and real benefits to people who are suffering. How do you create that sort of balance between the autonomy the right to make decisions for yourself and having some sort of more regulated framework? Sir.
Sir, where?
There you are.
Thank you. I'm Mike Shapiro. I'm at the University of Bath. I want to say a bad word here, so you may want to cover your ears.
Say it very loudly.
I want to say a bad word.
Say it very loudly.
Eugenics.
Yes, okay.
The history there is very, very, very disturbing because we all know how it worked out. But once upon a time, that was very much the accepted viewpoint of progressives, of educated people who wanted the best for humanity. And I think no one has said that, but I think that history is sort of lurking in the collective unconscious about why people are so freaked out and nervous about where this can head, because it runs smack up against questions. Once we have control over what people can be, what is it that's good for people to be?
Yeah, so I read a UNESCO...
Thank you. Very good question.
I hope this is as good an answer. I've read a UNESCO comment about and they mention eugenics in that comment and say that it disguises it disguises it's being disguised by the fact that we might get better from this sort of enhancement or improvement. But what we're largely talking about here today is not eugenics. It's about making sick people better. Yeah, and there is obviously later, maybe 20, 30 years' time, a risk that there will be a desire, maybe, to take humanity up a step. And some people, very prominent scientists around the world, are already saying we should try and do that, or at least, being provocative about it. So, but for everything that you've heard today is about disease, and I don't think that in any way is a problem for people to be made better. That's what we've been doing for thousands of years,
Yeah. Yes, I'm going to...
It's implied in the technology. It's implicit in the technology that those questions are there.
I'm going to draw that out. So it's implicit in the technology. I mean, I think this is a really important part of this debate, because it is that whole idea of pursuing perfection carries with it the fears that people have, and you'll hear it from many people who are in the disability movement who will say, what is it saying? What is the messaging to people who are less than perfect? What is it saying about a society that privileges that concept and that doesn't look at the other things that people bring who may have certain kinds of imperfection? And so there are serious issues in amongst all of this. But I wanted where's the microphone? Can somebody wave to me? Could you bring it down, please? Because there's someone here, lady in the green top, and then my friend who's just a row behind, please. Thank you.
I was just wanted to follow on there and pick up on what Sarah said earlier at some point as well, that we have had a lot of these discussions before in the cloning era, as I come from the Dolly Institute, and one of the things that was discussed then was cloning would be, in humans, would be a route to genetic change for basically eugenic purposes. And of course we actually shelved it. We chickened out of that one because the risks of the technology were so great. We didn't end up having to address the issues. And I think you're wrong, because you can't allow something for you have to think about the regulation about allowing it for a purpose to treat a disease as different from a purpose that is a eugenics purpose. And as Robin said, how do you make that distinction? So I think it is a much harder it's a much harder issue if you're talking about germline editing than about somatic gene editing.
Well, I think you can make a distinction. I mean, I think it would pose drafting challenges to lawyers, but and legislators. But I think that you can make a distinction, and one would have to seek and grapple with that. But that is the area that you have to grapple with. That's the wicked problem.
I wasn't clear, Mike, whether your comment was suggesting that this is why there may be lurking concerns around this technology, or whether you want to say that because it is inherently eugenic, we ought not to pursue this. But let's assume that even if you don't think the latter way, there are people out there who have made that argument to me before. So I'd like to actually unpack this idea of eugenics a little bit. I think you're absolutely right, eugenics is a bad word, but it's not bad because we think that people having healthier lives because their genes are incidentally better is bad. It's bad because it represents coercive control of state reproduction. Now, actually, an individual choice to have a child who's going to have a life with less suffering is not eugenic in that sense. So actually, we need to ask, I very much think, my experience with the public dialogue has borne this out as well, that we need to move past slogans and waving linguistic flags such as eugenics and designer babies around. These words have been used so often that they've almost lost moral meaning other than as a marker of something that's automatically bad. And actually we need to try and get to the heart of, well, what would be bad about it? If we had regulation saying that if you have a genetic disease, you must use this, that would be coercive, that would be terrible, but nobody's suggesting that that should be the case.
No, but Sarah, you're missing a piece, which the piece is that it doesn't have to be state-controlled. We know that the nature of cultures and norms that grew up inside societies can of themselves, it doesn't have to be coming as a diktat from an authoritarian state or a state that's saying we're not going to have these kinds of inferior people being born or whatever. It doesn't have to be like that. It's the business where people start feeling that somehow to be the bearer, the person who has a child that has disability somehow singles you out, that you haven't taken the right steps to prevent this happening, that you were somebody who was out of step with the sort of societal demand for producing babies that don't have any detriment or any things. So it's part of a hegemony rather than that it is state dictated.
I absolutely understand that as well, but at the same time I think a society where people are healthier as the cumulative result of individual choices that shape each other is a very different prospect to the sort of coercive eugenics that we saw that is the spectre there. But I absolutely take on board that what the cultural norms are around disease, disability, etc., may themselves shape people's choices. That's one that... Because
we started, when the Human Genetics Committee was sitting, we started seeing, as it was getting towards, maybe we'd been in existence for about 6 years, was that more and more tests were taking place amongst pregnant women, where women would often say they didn't feel that they were ever talked through whether they needed to have certain tests done when they were pregnant, that it was an automatic assumption that you were going to have all these tests done and you would be told whether you were carrying certain things or whether there was any risk or whatever of, and there was a sort of hold on a minute thing of shouldn't it be explained, and people can make choices about whether they want to have those tests done, or were they being made to feel as if they were weirdo people because they said, well, actually, if I'm going to have a Down syndrome child, that's a choice that I might decide to make, and that's I'm not going to have anybody telling me that I shouldn't be doing that.
Yes, which is why alongside all of these great advances in medical technology that are promised, we also need to help develop people's critical faculties around medical normativity to be able to say, well, hang on, just because we can do something with the technology doesn't mean that we have to be that way. We want to equip people with those critical skills to say, well, this is a form of normativity that's coming from somewhere, and I have the ability to choose whether or not I'm going to go with it, whether to resist it, how to resist it. I think we need all of those, and that's where
better conversations.
That's where the philosophy side comes in.
I agree very much with what Sarah said. I mean, there's two examples we can cite. So one, of course, is Iceland, where Downs is now almost no children are being born with Downs because they're being screened out. That's not involving CRISPR. That's a different technology.
No, of course.
Likewise, in Israel, and that might be a surprise, but in Israel, Tay-Sachs is now almost gone. And that's, again, nothing to do with CRISPR, that's to do with various ways of screening before marriage or PGD or other things. So
I only see that as a very good thing.
Yeah.
But some people may not, may not, I don't know. Yeah. Can you see anything other than a good thing?
No, but there are groupings, and it's very important that in society there are debates around it and that people are allowed to have their voice and being heard on it. Let me, yes, please, yes.
Peter Brody from King's College London. I'd like to pick up on 2 points. One is the issue of the domain of regulation. I can understand about local, countrywide regulation, but I think we've been here before, but this time it's slightly different. Firstly, in terms of the so-called designer babies, which is one of the things you always see in the press about this. And I think that's quite important because when you look back on the beginning of that era, 1990-ish, it was always going to be, we're going to be doing more and more in designing babies. That never happened in that time, and whichever country you look at, it hasn't happened. What has happened is a misuse of that technology for fertility purposes. It's actually been a technology that has been taken by many big pharma companies and sold to women who have infertility, not because of genetic abnormalities, but as a way potentially to improve their fertility, which it hasn't done. It's been a big push to achieve that. But we're at a point, I think, the bit that I think we're different now is that this technology is coming and is going to enable the kind of changes that people have been wary of. There are going to be instances where this is going to be much more powerful and much more appropriate than pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and that technology. And the big problem is, where do you regulate it? We have very tight laws in this country about what we do, but you can go anywhere in the world and have other things done. We've seen this in the stem cell world, where you can have all sorts of technologies done wherever you like, with technologies that don't work and may be unsafe. So although we can sit and pontificate about regulation within the kind of framework we're dealing with now, this is an international problem. It's a much bigger issue because it can be done anywhere in the world and in small scale. And I think that's, I don't know how one addresses that, because it's not that small.
I mean, I can say, there are obviously various approaches that we're all thinking about, which is, first of all, you have these sorts of meetings around the world. If we are, the UK is quite good at regulation, as you say, and so if we can help develop regulatory norms, ways of advising on how you should regulate this, such that other countries that are thinking about regulations or want to change their regulations can adopt that way of doing things, then that's how you can perhaps propagate sensible regulation to other countries. There's going to be another big summit meeting on genome editing in Hong Kong in the end of November. The idea being to have a discussion in that part of the world as much as we can to involve those countries where regulations are extremely variable, some very tightly regulated countries, some with no regulations at all. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens there and how people want to engage with us in doing all of this.
We're running out of time, but I'd like this gentleman on the right to come through.
Paul Fremont, Imperial College. Just a very quick question. It hasn't been talked much, but the cost of these therapies are quite extraordinarily high, I think, at the moment, although obviously they could come down. A provocative question could be, would this increase the inequality in the world, these kinds of therapies and these kind of approaches, or how do we deal with that? That's more of a devil's advocate question. Quite keen to know what the panel thinks about cost.
Well, I'm just going to say that it was one of the things that I remember as being part of the debates early on with IVF and so on. Isn't it going to be the privileged who do this and so on? And isn't it just a matter of time before it filters on down through society and that things then become cheaper as they become, more available? I mean, other people will know better than I do, but...
Yeah, that's obviously true. But I think one of the complications here particularly is we're talking about cures, not treatments that you take for the rest of your life, which are often very cheap. I'm thinking of the Gilead company with Sovaldi, which was the Hep C drug that cured their liver failure, and they would have died or been in hospital for the rest of their lives, short lives otherwise, several years maybe, and then this drug cured them. And that was $85,000 per treatment when they launched it. And of course, there was outrage that it was such a costly drug. They tried to justify it on the fact that, they won't be in hospital for X years, and so we've added all those costs up, and that would have been more expensive than the $85,000, and we have to get our money back somehow. They have now, been challenged to bring the price down in other countries where they can't afford that sort of pricing, and it's all gone a bit quiet now. I don't know what's happened in the last couple of years. This is 2014. So I think some of these drugs are going to be expensive, but you've got to look at it in the fact that this is a cure rather than just treatment.
Yeah. Well, I agree.
Inequality. Are we going to see a thing where the rich countries of the world are going to have this stuff Poor countries won't. There'll be a very, you'll have tourism to go and see what the developing world looks like, because it will look different and there'll be far more ill folk. I mean, what?
No, I mean, I think there has that. First of all, I agree that prices will come down. I mean, somatic gene therapy is really expensive at the moment, but I'm hoping it will come down. It's one-off fixes, so that if you look at the cost of care over a lifetime, it can be really expensive for lots of diseases. If you're talking about heritable changes, then again, it's one quick fix, which is for the rest of the person's life, a long life, hopefully, and perhaps their children as well. So the costs, the equation get very different then. How you get equitable access, particularly to countries which are much less well off. So if you're talking about diseases like thalassemia or sickle cell, of course, many people in much poorer countries are often affected by that. So I don't know, I can't solve that one, but I mean, how you get reasonable costs of treatment to individuals in those countries is going to be a big challenge, but it's one that has to be worked on.
What about even in here, with the challenge that it would make on cost within a nationalised health service?
Well, I think if really it's cheaper to fix a problem than having to treat the patient for the rest of their life, it's going to help the NHS. It's not going to be bad, but that has to be worked out. You need health economists to be involved in this discussion. Sarah?
Good question, thank you. Sir, I'm just going to take one last question because we've really run out of time, and then I'll come to you, Sarah, straight off.
Yes, one question for the panel, of all the members of the panel. Do you think it's unethical not to enhance our children using germline gene editing as soon as we can safely do so?
Well, it was an interesting question because it is an interesting question, because it was the question that was being posed to the Human Genetics Commission, which was more and more of our hospitals now, when women are pregnant, the women are just automatically assumed to want all these tests done, and so there was a kind of assumption in that direction, and that the non-moral thing was to not have those tests because you were going to encumber future generations with illnesses that they wouldn't necessarily have to have.
Yeah, who wants to start?
That's a good one for you.
Look, we currently think it's unethical when parents don't get their children vaccinated, when they choose only to feed their children rice milk and not give them proper nutrition. We think it's unethical when parents expose their children to secondhand smoke. If and when treatments for disease using gene editing become commonplace and understood and safe in the way that vaccination is, in the way that environmental factors such as smoking and diet are understood, then we might start to say, well, if you let your child develop a really horrible disease that's going to cause a lot of suffering, then you're being a bit irresponsible. But we're not there yet.
But there'll be cases taken to the courts. I mean, there will be. I mean, like the Jehovah's Witness ones, which is about wanting, that people will take cases against parents who are not letting that stuff be available to children, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, there are different types of enhancements, of course, but from all sorts of things. But there's also two sort of classes. There's ones which benefit individuals and the ones which may be important for society as a whole. The classic example would be students taking Ritalin so they can stay awake all night studying and do better in their exams than they would otherwise, or giving Ritalin to school bus drivers or airplane pilots because you don't want them to crash. So the second is generally thought to be more acceptable than the first. So it may be that we have to enhance ourselves to survive climate change or fly to other solar systems and things. So that sounds crazy, but it may, they would be uses that people might find generally acceptable. But as Sarah mentioned, at the moment, I think the risks of doing this are too great to justify enhancement. I think once we've learnt enough, if there are no risks, then that's going to be a good debate to have then, but it's certainly not one that I think we need to have now, in a way.
Try it again in 20 years. Okay, listen, well, I think that we've run out of time. I'm getting signs from the front row. So can I just say to my panellists that thank you. It was wonderful having all three of you here today. It was really great. And thank all of you.